Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith. Less burdensome regulation has led to economic growth in some states, but Pennsylvania trails far behind. As the Commonwealth slips in population and job growth, one report argues that its red-tape-laden system will create more problems in the future. Joining me today is a Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Anthony Hennon. Anthony, tell us more about this red tape, and is this 14th in the nation ranking surprising?
Yeah, so no, clearly not. I think if you follow Pennsylvania state politics at all, there's a long-running thread from Republicans and also Democrats that Pennsylvania has a lot of regulatory burdens, barriers. There's a lot of veto points that can sink a project, whether you're promoting natural gas or whether you're trying to install solar panels, whether you're trying to get a business permit, a building permit. There's all sorts of issues that people get very passionate about and get very annoyed by. This study comes from the Mercatus Center out of George Mason University, where it found Pennsylvania is the 14th most regulated state. They counted more than 164,000 regulatory restrictions on the books. When you look into this, it's kind of interesting how they categorize these. Pennsylvania, above the national average, has more restrictions in areas like environmental protection, culture and the arts, and administration. But it has much fewer regulations in areas like health services and banking, insurance, and securities. So I think that kind of helps highlight one of the issues here with regulations, where when people hear about this, they kind of think the more regulations, the more protected an area might be. You know, we think of environmental regulations as making sure that people aren't polluting rivers, polluting lakes or streams. But the number of regulations isn't necessarily a strong corollary for the strength or effectiveness of regulations. Looking in Pennsylvania's neighborhood, it's not the worst. New York and New Jersey both rank second and third nationally as most burdened regulatory powers. Ohio's number 6. We are trailing Maryland. Maryland is only 21st. So Maryland's about average in terms of the restrictions or regulatory burdens on the books. But what's interesting here, again, this often gets broken down into Republicans wanting fewer regulations, Democrats wanting more. But that's not necessarily how this plays out. The states that are doing the best at getting some regulations off the books, they're kind of looking toward the lead of places like British Columbia in Canada, which is very much not a poster child for the right. We're looking at basically these techniques that places have been using. It's getting rid of burdensome regulations or ineffective regulations by using regulatory budgets, basically where they go in, and if you want to pass a new regulation, you have to get one off the books, or you have to kind of do a cost-benefit analysis to try to figure out, just because we have a regulation, is it doing a good job of regulating what we want? Is it giving us better outcomes? Or is this just a costly thing we're adding to the books without fixing a deeper problem?
So we've heard proposals like that in Pennsylvania before, for every new regulation, one off. And there's been a lot of focus on it in recent years, legislatively speaking, from both Republicans, as usual, and Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro. But do you think this report would have do you think that it's on the mind of legislators when they come back in the fall, or even as we go into the next legislative session in 2025?
It seems to be. On the Republican side, they've been talking about this for a few years, often in the context of the Department of Environmental Protection, but also as we see housing prices rise, this has become a bigger thing when we're talking about housing production, of what is slowing down builders from putting up new buildings, new apartments, new houses. And a lot of this is coming from zoning regulations. Have been a big headache, and they're very localized. There's not much done on the state level, but that may be changing. We're seeing Republicans talk about this much more. We're also seeing action among the Democrats. Shapiro has made a lot of hay about permitting reform with the DEP, or trying to find ways to get rid of some of this red tape. I think this also isn't necessarily directly considered a regulation, but at least a credentialing issue, where Governor Shapiro removed the college requirement for a lot of jobs with the state of Pennsylvania. So trying to find these barriers that are creating headaches on the local level or on the state level, and removing them, or trying to speed up these times. So it seems like there's an emerging bipartisan interest in it, but I think a lot of this gets mired in the details. what Republicans may be focusing on for deregulation is not necessarily what Democrats are. But I think this is a big improvement from 5 or 10 years ago, when this seemed to be much less of a important issue, something that's much more talked about among Republicans and Democrats, but that is shifting. From the Mercatus Center report here, one of the authors, Patrick McLaughlin, he argued, the big takeaway for me is even if you do the best job you possibly can when you're making regulations, thinking about the unintended consequences, you still shouldn't leave things on the books unexamined. I think that's becoming much more of a bipartisan position of, we're passing these regulations and people might assume they're doing something, but you really need to be almost brutal in reviewing these and questioning, is this doing the job we want it to do? And what is the cost of actually having this regulation? Whether this will lead to some big bipartisan compromise, it's hard to say. I don't want to assume something is going to come out of this, but I think it's more likely now than it was maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Anthony, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.